Okay, so you've given us a really fascinating set of medical papers
Mhm.
on geriatrics, pharmacology, and infectious disease. And it looks like you're particularly interested in how these areas all intersect when it comes to treating elderly patients.
Yeah, and that's such a crucial point to start with because, you know, treating older adults, it's not like treating a 20-year-old.
You're telling me, I mean, you look at the case of, what was her name? HW. Yeah, the 86-year-old woman from that Basic Concepts in Geriatrics article. And it's like, wow, talk about a challenge for doctors. Whole medical history there and a list of medications. I swear it was longer than my arm.
Yeah, and that's exactly what makes this whole deep dive so interesting, right? Because what works for a 30-year-old might completely backfire with someone like HW. Her case, with all those medications, it just screams polypharmacy, which is a huge issue in the elderly.
Polypharmacy. Okay. So that's where things get really complicated. I mean, we're not just talking about a bunch of medications, but a whole bunch of potential interactions.
Exactly. And those interactions can make it really hard to figure out what's going on. Like, you can have an older patient with a UTI, a simple UTI, and they
Yeah.
might not even spike a fever. Imagine trying to diagnose that.
Yeah. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Right. And speaking of puzzles, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we've got to talk about how aging itself changes how our bodies handle medication.
Yeah, it's not just about wrinkles and gray hair, right?
Not at all. Think of it like this. When we're younger, the way our bodies process drugs, like how they get absorbed and broken down and all that, it's like a well-oiled machine.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah.
But then we get older, and that machine, well, it might need a tune-up or two. Organs like the kidneys and liver, they might not be as efficient. And this is a big deal when it comes to certain medications, especially those that rely on the kidneys to get flushed out of the system.
Oh, okay. So what you're saying is a drug that might clear out of a younger person's body really quickly could actually hang around in an older person's system for much longer.
Exactly. In fact, that Basic Concepts in Geriatrics paper, it actually mentions digoxin as an example. That's a heart medication, and it's mainly cleared out by the kidneys. Doctors have to be really careful with the dosage for their older patients, especially if their kidneys aren't working at 100%.
That makes sense. Now, what about the liver? It breaks down drugs too, doesn't it?
It does, and it's another area where aging can have a big impact. The research you sent actually talks about diazepam, that anti-anxiety drug.
Hmm.
Well, it turns out that its metabolism can slow down as people get older, which means there's a higher risk of side effects if the dosage isn't adjusted properly.
So even medications that are generally considered safe can become risky when you factor in age.
Exactly. And that's why having this deeper understanding is so crucial. It's not just about knowing which drug to prescribe, but understanding why it's the right choice, or if it even is the right choice. That's how we can make sure older patients are getting the safest and most effective treatment possible.
And all of that is without even thinking about any pre-existing conditions.
Oh, for sure. You have to remember many older folks are dealing with things like diabetes, heart disease, you name it. And these conditions can make the whole medication puzzle even more complicated.
Right, because it's like all these factors are influencing each other. It's a delicate balance.
It really is.
And then on top of all that, you mentioned that infections often present atypically in the elderly. So even if they have an infection, getting the diagnosis right can be tricky.
You got it. Like I was saying before about UTIs, sometimes that fever, which is often our first clue that something's up, it just doesn't show up in older patients, or it's much less noticeable.
Wow, so we're talking about a population that often has multiple health conditions, might be on multiple medications, and to top it all off, might not even show the typical sign of being sick.
Exactly, which is why this area of medicine, geriatric care, it requires a really special kind of awareness. It's about connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture, and understanding that even common health problems might need a totally different approach.
It makes you wonder how often things get missed. I mean, the articles mention pneumonia, UTIs, and skin infections as being pretty common in this age group.
Yeah.
What makes them so susceptible to those, would you say?
Well, there are a few things at play. As we get older, our immune systems naturally decline. It's just a fact of life. It's like our body's defense system isn't quite as strong as it used to be.
So it's almost like our bodies become less effective at fighting off those infections as we get older.
Exactly. And then you add in other health problems that are more common in older adults, things like diabetes, heart disease. Those can further weaken the immune system. So it's like their bodies are fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts.
And it doesn't help that so many older adults are in hospitals or living in long-term care facilities.
Right, because while those settings provide crucial care, they can also expose people to more infections.
It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, the basic concepts in geriatrics article actually highlighted that the higher rates of healthcare associated infections in the elderly. It's not surprising when you think about it. A weaker immune system coupled with increased exposure. It's a recipe for infections to take hold.
And then we get into the whole challenge of treating those infections, which, as we've been saying, isn't always straightforward in this population. We're talking about antibiotics, antifungals, even botanicals, all with their own quirks when it comes to treating older patients.
It's about choosing the right tool for the job, but also understanding how that tool might work differently in the hands of an older adult. Let's take antibiotics, for example. We know they're essential, but then you have the issue of antibiotic resistance rearing its ugly head, especially with older adults.
Yeah, the research you sent mentioned MRSA and VRE as examples, and those sound a little intimidating.
Yeah, they can be a real challenge. MRSA, that's methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and VRE is short for vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus. Basically, we're talking about strains of bacteria that have become resistant to some of our most common antibiotics.
So how do doctors even begin to tackle that, especially when treating a population that's already more vulnerable to infections?
It's a multi-pronged approach for sure. One of the key things is something called antibiotic stewardship.
Okay, antibiotic stewardship, what exactly is that?
Basically, it means using antibiotics wisely. So, not prescribing them unless they're absolutely necessary, and then making sure the specific antibiotic chosen is the best match for the infection.
So it's about using the right antibiotic for the right bug, like a lock and key.
Exactly. You want to make sure you're using the right key for the right lock, and not just trying any key in the bunch. The goal is to reduce unnecessary antibiotic use, which is a major driver of antibiotic resistance. And some hospitals are even using these things called antibiograms now.
Antibiograms, those sound pretty high-tech. What are they?
Well, they're pretty interesting. They're basically reports that hospitals use to track which antibiotics are working best against the specific bacteria that are circulating within that hospital.
So it's like having a constantly updated game plan to fight off these resistant bacteria.
You got it. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's not forget about fungal infections. Those are another area where we need to be extra vigilant when treating the elderly.
Right. Those can be pretty nasty, especially for older adults. I remember reading about Candida and Aspergillus, those fungi. It said they can be really dangerous for folks with weakened immune systems or who have been in the hospital.
You're remembering correctly. And what makes these fungal infections even more concerning is that they can be very aggressive and therefore difficult to treat. Early diagnosis is absolutely key here.
So we need to catch them early.
Absolutely. And luckily, we have tests for that nowadays, like antigen and antibody tests, which help us diagnose fungal infections faster. But there's another piece to this puzzle that we often overlook, particularly when we're dealing with elderly patients who might have decades of medical history.
Let me guess. Polypharmacy.
That's a big one, but I was thinking more about drug allergies.
Oh, right. With more birthdays comes more opportunity to develop allergies.
Exactly. Plus, you have to consider that a lot of older patients might not even remember if they had a reaction to a medication, especially if it happened years ago.
Yeah, how do you keep track of everything?
That's where good communication and thorough record keeping come in. The basic concepts material emphasizes how important it is for healthcare providers to get a complete picture of their patients' medication histories, including any past allergies or bad reactions they've had. And it's not just about true allergies, the kind that involve the immune system.
Wait, so there are other types of allergic reactions?
There are, or at least reactions that seem like allergies but aren't actually caused by the immune system. We call those pseudo-allergic reactions.
Pseudo-allergic reactions, that's a new one.
They can be just as uncomfortable as true allergies, maybe even dangerous in some cases. Point is, we gotta be thorough, ask the right questions, and really listen to what our patients are telling us. It's like piecing together a puzzle, like you said earlier.
And speaking of puzzles, you mentioned botanicals before. Those are a whole other beast, right?
They can be. Many people assume that because something is natural, it must be safe.
Right, like how can chamomile tea be bad for you?
That's a common misconception and a potentially dangerous one, particularly for older adults.
So even though my grandma swears by her daily dose of ginkgo biloba,
You got to be careful. Botanicals can have some tricky interactions with prescription medications, sometimes with pretty serious consequences.
what?
One of the articles actually mentioned ginkgo biloba interacting with blood thinners like warfarin. Combining the two could increase the risk of bleeding, which is a major concern for anybody, but especially for older adults who are already more susceptible to bleeding issues.
So even if something is natural and you can buy it over the counter, it doesn't automatically mean it's safe, especially if you're taking other medications. It seems like good communication is crucial here.
It's essential. Patients need to be completely open with their doctors about everything they're taking, even those seemingly harmless vitamins and supplements.
And doctors need to be thorough in asking about them.
Exactly. It's a two-way street. Open communication between patients and doctors is paramount for safe and effective treatment, especially in this age group.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered about something as seemingly straightforward as treating infections. And what's really striking is that we've just scratched the surface when it comes to understanding how age impacts a person's response to medication and illness.
Oh, absolutely. What we've talked about today is just the tip of the iceberg, and that actually brings us to a fascinating and rapidly developing area in medicine, personalized medicine.
Personalized medicine. Tell me more.
Imagine a future where we can use a person's genetic information to predict how they'll respond to specific medications.
So instead of using the same approach for everyone, we're talking about custom-tailored treatments based on your genes. That sounds like something straight out of Star Trek.
It might sound futuristic, but it's becoming a reality. We're already seeing things like pharmacogenomic testing.
Pharmaco what now?
Pharmacogenomic testing. Basically, it looks at how your genes might influence how your body reacts to certain drugs.
So instead of waiting to see how someone responds to a medication and maybe having to try a few different options, you could potentially use their genetic information to find the best and safest treatment from the get-go.
You've got it. It's all about minimizing risks, which is even more important for elderly patients, right? They're often more susceptible to those adverse drug events.
It's incredible to think that we might be able to treat illnesses this precisely in the future.
Yeah.
It could revolutionize healthcare.
It truly could. There are still challenges to overcome, but the progress being made, particularly in areas of pharmacogenomics, is incredibly promising.
This whole conversation has been eye-opening. It really makes you appreciate how much goes into providing good healthcare, especially for older adults.
It really does, and it highlights how dynamic the field of medicine is, always evolving, always seeking new and innovative ways to care for patients.
It's like we've traveled through time with this deep dive, from the immediate challenges of treating infections in older adults to this amazing future where personalized medicine could change the game entirely.
It just goes to show you these fields we've been talking about, geriatrics, pharmacology, infectious disease, they're all interconnected. You can't really understand one without considering the others.
It really underscores how much thought has to go into treating patients as they age. It's not as simple as, oh, you're 70, here's the standard dose.
Absolutely not. You hit the nail on the head there. It's about understanding that what might work perfectly well for a younger person could be completely inappropriate or ineffective for an older adult. Their medical history, their lifestyle, their individual needs, all of that has to factor into the equation.
There's that detective work again.
It's essential. Healthcare providers have to be so thorough, asking the right questions, really listening to their patients, and then piecing it all together.
And so much of what we've talked about boils down to good communication.
It really does. That open, honest communication between patients and their doctors, and even between different doctors on a patient's healthcare team, it can make all the difference.
Sharing information, understanding the risks, and working together to figure out the best approach for that individual patient.
Absolutely. And this is especially critical for elderly patients who might be seeing a cardiologist, a rheumatologist, a primary care physician, all these different specialists. Making sure everyone's on the same page can be life-saving.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key things you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
Well, first and foremost, aging isn't a one-size-fits-all process. Everyone ages differently, and their healthcare should reflect that.
It's about personalized care, not just age-based care.
Exactly. Second, we have to remember that medications, even those we generally consider safe, can have very different effects on older patients. So being aware of those potential interactions, adjusting doses carefully, and keeping a close eye on how patients are responding, that's crucial.
And listeners, don't underestimate the power of being your own advocate. Ask questions, speak up, and make sure your voice is heard.
Absolutely. And finally, while there are certainly challenges in treating infections in older adults, especially with the rise of antibiotic resistance, we can't lose sight of the incredible advancements happening in medicine. Personalized medicine holds so much promise for improving how we diagnose, treat, and manage health in aging populations.
It's an exciting time to be in medicine, despite the complexities. We're always learning, always refining our approaches to make sure patients of all ages are getting the best possible care. Well, this has been a fascinating exploration. I think we've all learned a great deal about this intricate intersection of geriatrics, pharmacology, and infectious disease. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.